Recording from our respective locations, I'm Public Affairs Director Matthew Huffman, and this is Momentum, a webcast produced by your coalition connecting advocates across our state. In this episode, I am welcoming two new folks to join us today. I'm very excited to chat with these two colleagues of mine who I've had the opportunity to work with several times. So Melanie Austin from MOXA and Jessica Seitz from Missouri Kids First. Melanie, Jessica, welcome.
Thank you for
having
me.
Hi.
All right, well, like I mentioned, I'm really excited to have y'all join me on the webcast this month. Melanie, you and I have had the opportunity to work together several times over the last few years on different statewide initiatives. We've trained together a few times. I think we probably talk nearly every month about one thing or another, so I'm excited to have you on the webcast. And then Jessica, I think that you and I also talk practically every month with the advocacy cohort that we're in through MFH. So it's nice to have a bit of a change of pace and to talk to y'all in a different context.
Absolutely.
So to get us started, I just wanted to be able to give y'all an opportunity to introduce yourselves, where you work, and kind of the scope of work that y'all do. So Melanie, if you want to get us started.
Yeah, so Melanie Austin, and I work at MOXA, which is the Metropolitan Organization to Counter Sexual Assault. And I've been there for almost 10 years, working in the field of sexual violence prevention and response. So MOXA is a rape crisis center serving the Kansas City metropolitan area. And for a number of years, I've been directing the education department at MOXA, which oversees all of our education and prevention programming that we do with youth and with adults. And so I'm actually in a new position right now. At MOXA, I'm the Assistant Vice President of Programs, and I work with all of our programs. We also provide counseling to victims and their significant others, as well as advocacy for victims. So I'll go back to education. We've been we're in over 30 school districts providing presentations around sexual abuse and assault and related topics to elementary students, and middle school, high school students. And then we also provide presentations to adults on how to support survivors, have a trauma-informed response around also prevention in general. And we've been doing this a number of years. We've enjoyed really good relationships with our school partners. And so I, when this guidance came out and the opportunity to serve on this task force became available, I was just really excited to be a part of it. So I'll stop there because I know we'll talk more about it.
Yeah, well, thanks, Melanie. And also congrats on the new position.
Thank you.
Yeah. Jessica, how about you?
All right, so Jessica Seitz, and I'm the Director of Public Policy with Missouri Kids First. And so in that role, I wear a lot of hats, but my primary role is advocating for Missouri's child advocacy centers and the issue of child abuse prevention and intervention overall before both the legislature and with state agencies. And so the way that I kind of got involved with this issue is that we worked on the legislation. We actually led the legislation that kicked this whole project off in 2019. So yes, and we also at Missouri Kids First are the state chair of the task force on the sexual abuse prevention of sexual abuse of children, which was the co-lead of this project.
Thanks. And before we get too far into talking about the specific legislation and the new guidelines from DESE, Jessica, can you talk a little bit more about the task force? And it covers a wide range of work. And so I want to be able to just have our listeners kind of understand a bit more about it.
Sure. So the task force is a huge part of Missouri Kids First work and has been since its inception. So it was actually put into statute back in 2011. And since then it has been subsequently reauthorized, but it has remained active. It's one of those groups and coalitions that has remained active throughout that time. Over the years, its scope and the different subjects that it's focused on have changed based on the needs of our state in the field of child abuse prevention. And several subgroups have spun off over the years. So I will say that the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence has a spot on that task force and has since it passed. So somewhat you all have been a participant from the start, and maybe different folks representing, but both on the full task force and the subcommittees. And I'll just touch on the subcommittees because honestly, the biggest work gets done in those committees. There's been maybe 6 or 7 over the years. One, for example, is on youth with problematic sexual behaviors, which MOXA also participates in. One has been on the multidisciplinary approach to child abuse investigations. One was on mandated reporting of child abuse when we had a new law change. So, that they have come up as kind of in response to legislation passing that we need to work on implementing, or efforts to try to get the law to change. And so you get like a kind of subgroup together who are really ready to roll up their sleeves. So, we are the chair of the full task force, and then coordinate a lot of those working groups.
Thanks. I like the way that you just said in the subcommittees, they're the ones who really get a lot of the work done. So when you're ready to roll up your sleeves and actually put this stuff into practice, that's where the subcommittees come in. So
I think I forgot to say who actually is on the on the task force. I know I said you all, but I can also just say who else is on the task force. I apologize.
Yeah.
I dug into what we do before I said who they are. It's a mix of community agencies like us, and then it's state agencies. So all the state agencies that have a role in child abuse. So Department of Social Services, Health and Senior Services, Department of Education, Department of Mental Health, and so on. So it's a mix of private-public groups. Just thought that was important.
Yeah, it is really important. And I appreciate you mentioning that, because I think it's a really important thing to recognize that, we can work really hard on the state level to pass a bill, but once it comes down to implementing it, you need to bring the folks together from both public and private sectors to really get down to how does this bill affect the daily lives of Missourians? And so I think that is a really great thing to mention, just the fact that you have to bring these people together to really put these policies into practice.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Jessica, you mentioned it, that MOXA also serves on the task force and a few subcommittees. Melanie, would you mind just kind of talking about MOXA's role in the task force?
Yeah, so MOXA has been serving on the task force since the beginning, and kind of as Jessica mentioned, has been involved in a number of the subcommittees over the year. With this subcommittee in particular, MOXA's CEO had asked if I would be willing to participate, particularly because I have a lot of experience in working with education in the Kansas City area, but also running our program. One of the things that we also do at MOXA is we have a number of community partners that we collaborate with on some community coalitions, and it just seemed like a really good fit and a really good opportunity to be able to be a part of the task force.
Yeah. Well, the bulk of our conversation today is going to be around the new guidelines that came out from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And so I know that the task force was heavily involved in that. And before we get really into what the guidelines are and implementation of it, Jessica, I know that Missouri Kids First really worked on passing the legislation that got this started. So there's also a really great story that goes along with that. And I was hoping you could give us just the story and some background on House Bill 604.
Absolutely. So House Bill 604 was actually an education omnibus in its final form when it passed in 2019. But it really kicked off, the original bill was House Bill 739, and it was sponsored by Representative Rocky Miller. And this legislation was really an example of kind of a grassroots constituent-driven inspiration, and then how we work as a statewide advocacy partner. So unfortunately, it was inspired by a really troubling case in mid-Missouri where a young woman had been sexually assaulted by her teacher. And it turned out that, that teacher had been at several other districts in the school, and her family and parents contacted their legislator and said, how do we first address this practice, you know, how do we, what kind of laws can we put into place to address the practice of basically a teacher or school professional getting dismissed and then hired like at another school. But also like, how do we prevent this from happening? Like, what are some things? And so kind of brought the issue to the legislator. The legislator said, okay, so he, you know, I think they did some research. The first practice that I talked to about was the practice of teaching or going from district to district. That was called pass the trash. Unfortunately, that is what the field calls this policy. It was something that our state did not have, but several other states had. And so that was another component that was included in the final bill. But then this piece around requiring, so there was also a piece around requiring school board education, school board members to be educated in child abuse prevention and their responsibilities as leaders of their school districts. That was very important to this representative who had been a school board member before and said, everybody needs to know this is happening. I mean, lately, and so but then they also felt that, or this legislator also felt that including education in schools to try to work on that prevention piece. And so we worked to guide the language because to make it a little bit more consistent with, you know, the language in current law, because this legislator was brand new to this idea, but was inspired by this story and really wanted to be mobilized. So, you know, that it just showed, it really to me was inspiring to show that like individual action really can make a difference, because because of the motivation, we managed to get this bill passed in a year. Which is record time and certainly nothing I'd experienced.
Really never happened.
Yeah, really something I had not experienced when we first went in and said, how do we write this? So yeah, that's kind of where it came to be.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that story because I think it really does just highlight the importance of why we all have a role to play in public policy, and that lawmakers really want to hear from their constituents. So much of the work that they're doing in Jefferson City is based on what they hear from their constituents and their community and their community's needs. So I'm really grateful that you were able to share that story and just highlight the importance of that.
Yeah, it really came to be that way. So it was, and we were also able to rely, similar to the way that you all engaged with your members, we were able to rely on the expertise and input of child advocacy centers. So they came up to the Capitol, testified how these cases have happened. And so it was a really, like, it felt like everybody was a community-driven effort.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. It was really a community effort and bringing folks together around a cause.
Yeah, absolutely.
So kind of building on that, having it be a community effort, you know, once the House bill, omnibus bill was passed, then obviously there's a charge to start putting that bill into action. And so that's where the task force and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education comes in, and really pulling together what guidelines need to be in place around this. Mm-hmm. So Jessica, can you kind of talk about that work and just all of the different multidisciplinary folks who came together for that group?
Yeah, so when we were putting the language of the bill together, we were very careful in the way that we put some of this in. So the biggest pieces of the law around education in schools were that the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education was going to put out guidance and training materials, and that language was chosen carefully because Missouri very much values local control, and so the state is not expected nor really allowed to prescribe a curriculum. So it was, we will put guidance and training materials out. But we actually slipped in the language requiring the task force to do this in collaboration with DESE, because we really didn't want this to fall just on DESE's shoulders, because we know from our work in the task force that, you know, the people whose voices and expertise who are doing work like Melanie is about to speak on, those voices, you know, needed to be included. And so it was, I think DESE would have come to us anyway and asked for our help, but we went ahead and made it law. So, so when the bill passed, DESE came to us as the task force and said, so how are we going to collaborate? And obviously, given our role, and I said, we're going to have to do a subcommittee, right? Because this is going to take a lot of work. And so we used, we went ahead and started brainstorming who should be there. We essentially, on the state agency side, you know, we obviously had DESE and Missouri Kids First, we co-chaired it, but we did have representatives from all the other state agencies that are on the task force appoint someone who really does more education. So we still had Department of Health, we still had Department of Mental Health, Department of Social Services. They all designated kind of some ideal folks from their agencies to participate in the group. And then we had several child advocacy centers. So on my end, we had several child advocacy centers who have really prioritized education in schools as a part of their work. And we had a statewide. So I had some child advocacy centers from Southeast, from mid-Missouri, but then we felt it was important to also we had to loop in MOXA. Melanie's being modest, but MOXA really runs the show in the Kansas City area. And so we knew that. And so we brought in MOXA. And on the St. Louis side, we brought in Jewish Family Services because they too are a leader in the St. Louis area. So it was not just child advocacy centers, it was our other community partners, state agencies, but then we included some new people who had never actually been involved in the task force. So we had to get the buy-in of the education community. So we worked with DESI, that's their people. So, I go to my people, I go to my member, but I hadn't really worked with the school social workers, the school psychologists, the school counselors, and the school board association and the principals. And they recruited their side because we knew that starting with school board, school principals, and teachers, we needed the buy-in of this. It couldn't just be the task force saying, here's this information, go forth and process. They had to have the shared language. So that was a rather lengthy answer to say it was a very thoughtful process on who came in, because we needed the content expertise, but we also needed the buy-in and the education folks. So it was new people who had not participated in a work group before.
And I think that the way you've described how thoughtfully y'all pulled people together, it also underscores the importance of that public-private partnership again, that you really need to have the content experts there, you need to have the stakeholders there, you need to have people from levels of state and local government, as well as advocates working on state and local issues. So yeah, I think that really just does underscore the importance of partnerships across the public-private sector.
I learned a lot through the process of bringing in new people.
Always a learning lesson, right?
A learning lesson, great. But yeah, learning lesson.
I think if I can add something too, I just think it's so important to have diverse perspectives and just the way this process came together. And that really does help with the buy-in, as you mentioned, Jessica. And I think what I've seen even, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but even in the Kansas City area, there's already been some good response from school districts that have been reaching out to us and who really want to implement this guidance really well. And so I think it also just warms my public health heart and my prevention heart when you hear like, you need all these different perspectives to come together to have the greatest impact. And so I really think that I appreciate, Jessica, when you're talking about having that well thought out language included in the law to include that collaboration. I just think that was so smart and really great, again, to bring all those perspectives together to really end up with a really good product and service that can be rolled out in the community and really serve Missourians.
Yeah, I want to jump back for just a moment because I think both of you bring up a really good point about how to best serve Missouri communities. And Jessica, something that you mentioned was in Missouri, we as a state really value local control. And so there's no way for the state to really mandate a certain curriculum or one particular approach. But to both of your points about how thoughtfully y'all really approached this project, you included 4 specific prevention strategies to kind of tailor as Missouri communities need and kind of what they see as a priority. So can you kind of talk about those 4 strategies and how they were picked?
Yeah, so it was kind of a, it was thoughtful, but it was also, so I will say that we are fortunate that we had the experience of about 30 other states who had done similar, engaged in similar stakeholder in various ways, didn't look exactly like ours, but several, like over 30 states have some kind of requirement for sexual abuse education in schools. And a lot of districts or their departments had taken this approach of pulling together an advisory group or working group or something to put out a document for their districts. Some people use different language, but so we did have a lot of reports to pull from who had done this, had done this work. So we relied, like, for example, the two states that we thought had excellent documents were Georgia and Washington, but there were several others that we kind of discovered that people brought to us, that were on the working group saying, oh, Georgia did something like this, we've looked at it. So when we were looking at prevention approaches, we felt that, the document's very comprehensive, but we were like, okay, first we need to educate people about the issue and the way that child abuse can be prevented before we then go into the nitty gritty of like K through 2, 3 through 5. I mean, like the curriculum, it was like, let's talk about prevention. And so I'd say we did a curriculum review, a literature review, and really stakeholder meeting input. So for example, the whole school community whole child, so the WISC model, is something that is very well known regarded in the education community. It's more of an education-based model of work, but the idea is that you approach learning through using different community assets. So it was like involving the community, that schools aren't responsible for everything. And that is a CDC, I think, sponsored program. I don't know all of the details exactly, but that's something that our health educators really, really latch onto, and like its best practices. And the education felt very strongly that the WISC model of learning or prevention should be included in the sexual. And so something I'm not sure we would have included without the education and the health education recommending it. Now, the social ecological, we got the public health model down to a science. I mean, that's our language, right? We have all about those approaches, the CDC model of violence prevention. We know we could write that in our sleep, or at least Melanie could. But so we included that. We included trauma-informed, and I can't underscore the trauma-informed, that we actually put trauma-informed education into the law as well. And we felt the need to really put a whole section on a trauma-informed approach to prevention, because that came up over and over. This content, you may be delivering it to kids that have already experienced sexual abuse. And you also have to recognize that some of the faculty or the adults who would be delivering the education also may have been experienced sexual abuse. So trauma-informed is an approach to prevention, but it really should be threaded throughout. So those are kind of how I said it was just a lot of information sharing on the field that came up with these approaches.
And again, I think it underscores the importance of bringing together those diverse stakeholders, because we know that Missouri is a really diverse state, and everybody is going to have a different need in their community. So I think it was a really thoughtful approach in the way that you gave people options and really, really thought about what are the core tenets that people need to be thinking about, but how can they adapt this? So I think that that's a really, really good point to make.
Yeah, if I can jump in quick too, I think it's really important in the sense that, I just think about the work that we've done in Kansas City, like the metro area. So we have very rural schools that we serve. We have private schools, charter schools, public schools, big schools, small schools. There's just a lot of diversity in all those schools, and the same approach isn't going to work for every single school. And so that's one of the things that I love about these four kind of prevention approaches, is that you can adapt and you can work within these frameworks to find the best fit for addressing sexual abuse and assault, for having a greater impact on your particular school community. And so I really love that they were included, and that was, acknowledged that that's really important. And I think we've seen firsthand that we have to adapt our work depending on what community we're going into and what their needs may be. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate you mentioning that, Melanie. And I want to kind of stick on that topic for a little bit, just because I know you have a wealth of experience and expertise working in Kansas City schools, working with other community partners in the Kansas City area. So I kind of want to hear your perspective on two things. One, what do you see as the role for advocates from child advocacy centers, rape crisis centers, domestic violence programs? What's the role for an advocate to play in this? And then adding on to that, what's the role for other community partners? How do we really mobilize communities around this effort?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, you know, one of the things that I've always said about the work that we do at Moxa is that we can provide expertise and knowledge in implementing programming and education around sexual abuse and assault. And the benefit to that, whether it's a child advocacy program or a DV program or a rape crisis center like Moxa, when we go in and provide programming around this sensitive topic, we can also help if we need to respond. So, you know, we have well-trained staff in trauma-informed response and crisis intervention. You know, there's been a number of times that we've worked with schools when we've had a child disclose, you know, something that's happened to them, and they disclose because they realize that, you know, the information that they're getting, like, this isn't right, what's happening to me. And so I think that's really the benefit of having a well-trained person come in who has the expertise, who stays up on what's the latest and what's the best way to provide this information in a developmentally appropriate way to the students. And then not only do we provide that information, but we can respond. And then we can connect that student, that school, that community, that family. We can connect them to the resources that they may need, whether that's a Moxa who can provide counseling, or you know, a child advocacy center, or you know, a DV place, whatever kind of resource it is that they might need in the community. And that's really the benefit of also connecting other community partners. So one of the things that we do also in the Kansas City area is that we work on talking with other community partners in the area, you know, and we learn about what programs each and resources we each have to offer. And that way we can more easily connect people, or we can say, hey, you know, school partner, you may want to check out this program as well. It would work really well in tandem with what we're doing. So I think, again, you're able to collaborate and have a bigger impact on not only trying to prevent sexual abuse and assault, but also being able to respond and to help people get the help that they need, the resources that they need, help them to heal, and you know, I guess, you know, heal from what's going on. So I think that's really the benefit. And I think that it's really possible for schools to work with their community partners. We have lots of schools in the area that do that really well. And I think it can take some of the burden off of them. You know, it can take some of the burden that they're responsible for so much, and they do so much with their students and their families and their community. And I think if they can bring in their community partners to help provide some of this information in a trauma-informed, sensitive way, that can really just help them as well meet this new requirement.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about that as you were talking, Melanie, that part of the reason it's so important to have these community partnerships is that it helps to lift the burden off of teachers and school counselors and school social workers, because we ask so much of them already. And whenever we can bring in other community professionals to really help lighten that load, it's a benefit to everyone. And something else that you mentioned that I just kind of want to lift up is the really holistic approach to this. So recognizing that even though the idea is to teach about preventing childhood sexual abuse, we also have to recognize the reality that some youth might have already experienced abuse or have witnessed abuse. And so that can be really triggering for them once they start to see the traumatic things that they've experienced. And so having this holistic approach of being able to connect them to resources and support is such a really vital part of this too.
Yeah, and I was just thinking too, there's a lot of schools I think already, you know, doing this really well in the Kansas City area. And so I think it's really exciting though to have this law and then this guidance come out, because it's so important. I mean, I just can't tell you how many times we've provided a presentation and somebody, you know, a child or a student has disclosed then after that, and then we're able to get them the help that they need. And I just can't imagine, you know, I've heard a number of survivors speak who are like, well, I just didn't know. And then just to hear how it impacted their life, you know, after that. So anyways, it's just really, really important. And I think there's a good sense of community and collaboration in the task force itself. You know, I've even loved the ability to network with other folks on the task force and, you know, coordinate or just talk about how we can collaborate as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And the other thing I'll mention in terms of prevention, you know, being able to coordinate community resources and collaborate and connect is a prevention factor. And the more that we can do that and do that well, the more we will prevent sexual abuse and assault from happening in our communities.
Beautifully stated.
I'm going to agree with that. Beautifully stated, Melanie. Again, this is where I think if you put the three of us in a room, we could talk about prevention all day long. So I want to also bring in the point that you just made about how policies are a part of prevention and how networking and building coalitions are a big part of our prevention work. We have a motto at MCADSV that our public policy work is not only focusing on how a bill becomes law, but how that law affects the daily lives of women, men, and children in Missouri. And so I think that we've been able to have a really great discussion about that, from how this law was developed and passed, and then now how we're really able to start implementing it in Missouri communities. So Jessica, I want to jump back to you for a moment and ask, now that y'all have worked as a task force alongside DESE to develop these guidelines, are there additional policy proposals or maybe potential legislation that you all are looking at to really help kind of support and bolster these efforts?
Yes, so I will say, if you check out the document, you'll see that it goes above and beyond the minimum requirements that were in the law itself. And we realized the law was just a kind of a minimum, because as soon as we all sat down first meeting, I heard 2 points. One, I will note that the law just requires at a minimum 6th grade and up. And I heard overwhelmingly from the schools, but from the CACs, and that people who already have been doing education in schools for years, that elementary was very important and probably one of the most popular, common programs to be providing. And so the law falls short by not including kindergarten. They're saying we're already doing this work. And so we really would like to go in and tweak that piece and just move it down to kindergarten, just to reflect what's currently going on in best practices. The other piece that came up, and Melanie touched on this a minute ago, is that we really, I want to emphasize, I can't emphasize enough that, you know, educating kids on child sexual abuse and prevention in these programs, we don't want to place the responsibility for the safety of kids on kids' shoulders. And that's not the intention of these programs. And that's really the responsibility of adults. So we really, I think the whole field agrees that you can't protect kids without educating adults. So both on how to handle a disclosure, which we know that will come out when we increase this work, how to handle what to do, but also how to work with that child, and then how to prevent, you know, like how to prevent this abuse from happening. And like so an adult focused education was, I mean, that was resounding. Like, we got to do the adults and kids at the same time, but like parallel. And so our law doesn't necessarily reflect that. Even our mandated report of the education we ask of teachers and school professionals, the law itself is pretty thin. And so we'd like to go in, you don't want to be overly prescriptive in statute to allow for, you know, them to modernize as we learn more, but we do want the law to really reflect. So I think that the adult focus piece and the age were the 2 pieces we'd like to work on in the law. And that came from the perspective of this group.
Yeah, again, that's where I think stakeholder feedback is so important. And there was something that you said that I really like and want to just touch on, which is really aiming for best practice in this. And something that I've heard many other colleagues say more around Title IX work is whenever you aim for best practice, you hit compliance every time. And I think that that's a really good way of thinking about how we implement public policy, is that oftentimes we should consider that the floor.
Yes.
But if we aim for best practice and really comprehensive and robust practices, we hit that floor of compliance every time.
I want to write that quote down. That was very, very true.
Well, I can't take credit for it. I have borrowed it from a colleague of mine in Oregon, but I say it a lot and then give her credit for it every time.
Love it.
So, Melanie, I know that y'all have done a lot of work at Moxa with really helping schools develop and refine their policies around policy and practice for creating safer school environments. I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a bit about how y'all see the next step of implementing these guidelines by really working with schools around policy development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when you're talking about doing prevention, and one of the things that we talked about was the social ecological model, and having change not only at the individual level in terms of education, but looking at that community and societal level of policy and practice change. And so while you can do that at the state level, you can also do that at the organizational level and look at what are our policies and practices in the school. And so one of the things that we've been talking about with some of our school partners is, could we work on doing a policy review in terms of prevention and response? And are there opportunities to improve those policies or add something new? Or, we've done a lot of education with schools. We have several schools where we do some long-term youth prevention programs that look at changing the whole school culture. And those are awesome and great opportunities to impact change. But really, I think to have an even bigger change than this, to look at those policies and procedures. So, one of the things that we've done is work with some of our school partners to look for funding that can help support this type of work. And hopefully we'll hear back soon on a potential funding opportunity that would allow us to spend some staff time essentially working with schools on these types of things. And then I'll kind of hop over to, we also have a coalition in Kansas City. It's that we facilitate, and it's the Kansas City, Missouri Sexual Violence Prevention Coalition. And that coalition is a group of community partners that have come together to look at how we can prevent sexual violence on the community and societal levels. And that coalition is also looking at this strategy of how can we work with organizations, schools, in particular in prevention and response, and looking at those policies and procedures. So I think for us, that's just another way for us to collaborate with the community and to bring forth, this is really important. And kind of like Jessica said, we don't have to reinvent the wheel around this. There are states, organizations that have already done this type of work and provided really great guidance around it. And so I'm really keeping my fingers crossed that we'll be able to start moving forward more with this strategy as we go. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm also curious from your perspective because, around the state, we have both CACs and DVSV agencies that are really interested in doing prevention, but might be having kind of a hard time getting that first step of getting a good relationship with their school, building a group of stakeholders who really want to take this work on. So for the folks who are looking at really getting into this work and getting started, what sort of advice would you have for them?
That's a great question. I always think about what are some of the things that have worked for us. And I think a lot of it starts off with that just relationship building and, we start off with just doing outreach a lot with schools and saying like, hey, we're here, here's the resources that we have. And then I think, there's those 9 principles of effective prevention for training. One of the things I always think about is we provide a well-trained staff. And we teach them about prevention and about sexual abuse and assault, and we stay up on the latest, and we also work on adapting our programming. And so we work to meet the school need. And I think part of prevention and response is knowing that not everybody is going to be at the same place. And I mean, there are times when people can make big changes in their lives, but oftentimes you have to stair step people. And so we always talk about meeting people where they're at, and then providing that need, that resource, that education to then step them up to the next spot where then they'll then be ready to maybe implement a more long-term, let's say, youth prevention program. Another thing that's been really great is just kind of pulling together community partners to collaborate. And so that way, when you do have opportunities that come up for funding, whether that's a grant or whatever that might be, then you can collaborate really easily together and talk about what kind of program do you want to do? Do you need letters of support? What might that be? So I think starting to just build those relationships so you can go to them and say like, hey, I saw this opportunity and we have to apply in a week. How can we work together on this? Like having that, really helps. And there's funding out there, and you might start small and then kind of build off of that. But I also highly recommend like working collaboratively and looking at funding collaboratively. There's a lot of work to be done, and, we all have a part and a role to play in helping to get that done.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you just said at the end there. There's a lot of work to be done, and also we all have a role to play in it. And so by working collaboratively, we are much stronger together when we combine our efforts and work towards those shared goals. Well, any kind of final thoughts on this for folks who are looking to implement the guidance, who want to know more about it?
I would check out the guidance. I understand we said there's a lot of information in there that we talk about different prevention approaches, the 9 principles of prevention. It is lengthy, but it is also very digestible. And I know that your membership, as well as my membership, will find it, very helpful. Like it really was. And so it's not just a long document. So I'd have it first take it out there and start with, for those who are looking to get engaged in the rollout of this initiative, to kind of do some of the things that Melanie touched on. I would recommend, starting to develop partnerships, if you have to the level that you have capacity, either a regional or local, county, whatever your working group around it, so that schools don't feel that they are alone, and that you feel like you're able to contribute. And so, I think we have to recognize that this is probably going to take a while. This is not just going to have to, roll out easily in school year 2020. And magically every school is going to, it's going to be just like when we've changed laws, it's going to be a rolling process, built off of successes and challenges. So I would say just take a look at the document, learn a little bit more about, and figure out where your place is.
Yeah, and the guidance will be linked in the comments section for this webcast, so it'll be easily accessible too.
Great.
Well, I always like to wrap up our webcast episodes with a question that doesn't really have to do with the topic that we've discussed, but kind of a fun, lighthearted question to sign us off. So in recognizing that the temperatures are getting cooler, it is back to school season after all, that we can be looking forward to fall. So I want to ask both of you, what are you most excited about with fall? And I'll get us started because I always like to give my own example while I give other folks time to think about it. I love sweater weather. And so the return of fall and me being able to wear cardigans in a seasonably appropriate time is very exciting for me.
I'll just second that. So to me, fall is just brings us closer to winter, which is my favorite season. I'll second your cardigan and just raise you a sweater dress. I cannot wait to wear. It's a perfect opportunity to wear something that's almost like a sweatshirt, but it's professionally appropriate. I'm ready. I'm ready for the cool weather. I'm ready for coats, hats, and sweater dresses.
So what I love about fall are just the bold, bright colors, and I love the cooler weather. So we have, I think it's called a 3-season porch at our house, but it's really a 2-season porch. You can really only use it in the spring and the fall. And so I'm just really excited and looking forward to being able to sit out on the porch with my cup of coffee, and I can like watch my kids play in the backyard. But I'll also say I love some fall activities too. We're going to actually take my kids to a corn maze tonight. So why not? And then come home and have a little fire with some s'mores or something. So
Nice.
I'm just really looking forward to that. I really don't like hot, humid, sticky weather. And I'm from Minnesota, so I hear you on the winters, my jam too. So
yeah, fire pits. Fire sounds great.
Yeah.
Yep. I'm also a big fan of fall festivals. So you can find a lot of really good fall festivals around Missouri between like the Pumpkin Fest, Apple Fest, Chestnut Fest. There are a lot of really fun things to go to. Maybe a little different this fall with the pandemic. Not sure how those will necessarily work out, but I'm sure there'll still be plenty of opportunities for, going to corn mazes and at the very least, fire pit time.
Yeah.
Agreed. And Halloween's always fun. And
Halloween is always fun.
I hope we have trick-or-treaters. I hope the trick-or-treating stands and we figure out a way to do that.
Yeah. We'll have to be creative and figure out a good way to do that, but certainly a fun time for everyone. Well, Melanie, Jessica, I want to thank you both so much for being on the webcast with us this time around. I think that y'all gave a really good highlight of the work that had to go into this guidance and now the work that continues after it. So we can both celebrate the success of this really important piece of legislation being passed and now having guidance to implement it, and recognize we still have more work to do and that we all have a role to play in that. So thank you both for being on the show with me today.
Thanks so much, Matthew.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll talk to y'all soon.
Sounds good.